Hey, Alissa. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Hi, Shane. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. It's really going to be centered around emotions and what they are, where they come from, what purpose they serve, and just learning more about, what makes us human. And characteristic of that is being emotions. And I know a lot of your work as a clinical psychologist deals with emotions anyway, but you seem to have a specialist interest in it, and that's really exciting. And so thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for being interested in having this conversation.
Sure. So, how about we start off with just some basic groundwork of, what's your understanding of exactly what are emotions?
That's such a good question. Probably not going to give a textbook definition here, but emotions are the experiences that we have in our body, and they typically follow some sort of a prompting event, right? Some event sets off that emotion. And there are many different components to the emotions, but and we can get into that kind of what makes up each unique emotion that we have. But I think at
Mm,
the most kind of one of the more important things to know is that emotions serve a really adaptive function. They're there to motivate and organize our behavior and to help us like communicate to other people, right?
mm,
So I realize I'm answering this kind of in a roundabout way.
it's okay.
But if you think about it, right, if I'm in a building and there's a fire, right, I need to be able to, if I'm kind of like, oh, the building's on fire, let me walk, to the exit and get out of here calmly. Chances are I may not get out as quickly as I should, and I may not get other people out of the building, right? So the emotion of fear that I might have in that moment is this really adaptive emotion that I wouldn't ever want to go without, that rapidly gets me to notice, yes, there's a fire. I need to respond immediately and to communicate to other people. So maybe I'm shouting fire and helping get people out of the building quickly. So
Mm.
these emotions are there for that adaptive function to help us kind of to guide our behavior and help us to communicate with others in a way that's going to be helpful.
Right. So, something happens in the external environment, or potentially internally as well, but let's say external environment that communicates something to us, and then our bodies create this emotional experience to organize it to behave in a certain way that's most appropriate for the situation, and it also motivates us to do some sort of behavior. And at the same time, it's telling other people through our emotional communication, so facial expressions, body language,
Yeah,
verbal expressions, that this is how we're feeling. And so, like, if we feel like we're in danger, other people should be concerned too, because maybe they're in danger as well.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. And so, does this apply to all emotions, even like the positive
Yeah.
ones?
Yeah, right. Because we have these, I've mentioned fear, which is an emotion that a lot of us experience as a negative, unwanted, kind of overwhelming emotion, right? And then we also have positive emotions. So love, happiness, excitement. And for those emotions too, right? So the same model that we can talk more about really applies no matter the emotion,
Mm.
that it's there for a reason. So if I feel love, maybe my kid looks at me in a way that like, makes me, wow, I really love this guy. You know, I I feel that emotion and I'm going to feel it in my body and I'm going to communicate that in the way I look at my son, in the way that I smile at him, or in the tone of voice that I use with him.
Mm.
So it kind of helps to let him know what's going on for me too.
So, would you say the adaptive function of love is connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are kind of wired to be able to connect with others, right? I think if you think just from an evolutionary perspective,
Mm.
it was really important to be able to have other people in your group for survival purposes. And so, yes, I think love is an emotion that's designed to help us connect for sure.
Love and empathy, actually. I would say empathy is another big one that allows us to connect and to form those
Yeah,
social bonds,
yeah,
right? That
for
are so
sure.
crucial to our survival as a social species.
Yep, Definitely, right? If you can't take on, if you can't pick up on someone else's emotion, right, what they're feeling, and try to help meet them where they are, maybe address their needs, it's going to be hard to form that connection.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's just, a bunch of robots just trying to figure out what's going on and not doing a very good job at it.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're very powerful, right? And they can be very overwhelming sometimes. And so, what happens when someone is overwhelmed by an emotion?
Great question. So sometimes really strong emotions can allow us to be highly effective, right? So if I'm like really angry about something and that leads me to take action and to, fight for something I really believe in, right? To, I don't know, maybe go and meet with my Congress member and like really kind of communicate how I'm feeling, that might be serving me well, that emotion there. I mean, it might lead to the change that I'm hoping to make. Sometimes, though, when we're really overwhelmed by emotions, we can it can really impact our behavior and we can act in ways that maybe aren't so effective, right? And that maybe not only aren't so effective for getting our goals met, but that might actually maintain and exacerbate that emotion that we're struggling to deal with in the first place. And the other thing that can happen too, coming back to this like empathy piece, right? If we think about the fact that like our emotions are there because in part to help communicate to others. And so if we're communicating an emotion to someone else, right? Let's say, I don't know, I'm scared. I'm anxious about something and I'm communicating that to you and you're telling me there's nothing to worry about. Any guess like how that might make me feel in that moment or what that might lead me to do?
Well, that would be frustrating
Yeah.
because you're saying, well, clearly there is something to be afraid of. And
Yes.
the fact that you're not feeling fear is unsettling for me because, well, that either means there's something wrong with me or it means there's something wrong with you and now you're in danger even more because you're not even willing to face the danger.
Yep, yep. And I might escalate, like, so in addition to feeling frustrated, like you said, I might also escalate in my intensity of my expression of fear, of anxiety, trying to get you to buy in that, like, yes, this is indeed something I should be afraid of. So that's the other thing, too, when we're feeling kind of overwhelmed by our emotions. It's almost like, especially if we're getting invalidated in some way. So, or if it's, if it's anger and my anger is being invalidated, well, then I might kind of up the ante a bit, trying to get you to buy in to the fact that my emotion is valid and makes sense. It's justified.
But so what happens when it's, because there are cases where it's like we come to learn that, well, we were wrong. And so the emotions weren't valid as such. I mean, my understanding of it would be like, okay, well, in the moment of an experiencing an emotion, it's valid in the sense of like, it's valid because you're feeling it. It doesn't mean it's true, though,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And you can see that with people who have like chronic anxiety and things like that,
For sure.
that are
Yeah.
just anxious all the time about things that feel real, and their emotions are real at the time, but they're not reflective of reality that's actually happening.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that brings us to a really critical piece about emotions, which is that oftentimes, so there can be a prompting event, something happens, and we have an interpretation of that event. And it's often the interpretation that then sets off the emotion. So if I think that it's really risky to touch something that I view as contaminated, and I'm really worried that I could get horribly ill and maybe spread that illness to all the people I love and care about, and that everybody might hate me if I do that, well, then I might be really anxious about coming into contact with that object and really not want to touch that object or that that person or whatever it might be that I view as contaminated. And so you're right. Like maybe that time, if first of all, if I continue to avoid touching that thing, well, then I teach myself that the only reason why it ended up being okay is because I didn't come into contact with that object, that thing. But if I touch it and maybe that time around I don't get sick, then I learn, oh, hey, maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Maybe I'm not necessarily going to get sick just because I flushed the toilet with my hand instead of my foot, right?
Yeah. So there's that reinforcement aspect of it, where we can reinforce our behaviors that we see as protective, but, they might be called safety behaviors or something along those lines that, we think we're doing to protect ourselves or other people, and then come to believe that, well, the bad things didn't happen because we're engaging in these behaviors.
Right.
And instead of it being the case that, well, the behavior itself wasn't even necessary in the first place. And so there's just all this time, energy, effort, and, suffering that goes into worrying and thinking and caring about all these things. Now, to be fair, some safety behaviors are obviously necessary.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you shouldn't be like, oh, well, let's just see what happens with everything in the world. It's like, no, there's real dangers out there, but it's about figuring out what's a reasonable risk to take.
Right.
Like, you can get sick from flushing a toilet with your hand, but you probably will be fine. And so is it worth the anxiety that goes into it every time to have that risk or not have that risk? And that's a tough one to assess, because it really comes down to the individual's preference for it, right? And how much suffering the anxiety is causing them, and is it worth it?
For sure. And what I'll say is, if it's obviously going to be up to the individual whether that's something they're going to test out. But unless you're willing to test it out, to give it a shot, like what happens if I flush that toilet without using my foot? You'll never know. Is that behavior really necessary or not? And you'll also never know, can I tolerate that emotion, the emotion of anxiety, or not? And so if you continue flushing with that foot, you may think like, oh, if I didn't do that, if I touch with my hand, well, I would fall apart. I wouldn't be able to handle that emotion. And oftentimes that's not actually the case, but you won't know that unless you give it a try.
That's true. And that fear of emotion is very powerful and profound, right? It feels like, would you characterize it as like feeling like we would die? Like some people have such an intense fear of certain emotions that they think that if I feel that, I'm basically going to die, and I'll lose control or something like that.
Yeah. I think that's really common, right? For people to really, really just not want to feel strong emotions. And if you think about it, we're kind of wired to not want to feel uncomfortable emotions, or to not want to feel pain of any kind, right? So if my hand's in the fire, what do I want to do? Or what do I do?
Yeah, you pull it out.
Yeah, of course, right? To escape that pain. And same thing, if I'm feeling anxious, if I'm feeling angry, if I'm feeling sad, if I'm feeling guilty, right? Whatever it is, it makes sense that those uncomfortable emotions, they might seem not only just painful, but also, like you're saying, kind of just unbelievably overwhelming and intolerable, right? Like, I can't possibly bear to feel this way a second longer. And so oftentimes what that leads us to do, coming back to your question of those strong emotions, what are those strong emotions? Kind of when we're feeling overwhelmed by an emotion, oftentimes it pulls us to try to turn off that emotion, to get rid of it immediately in some way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, there's no off and on switch to our emotions. And oftentimes when we try to find one, we end up inadvertently doing something that either keeps the emotion alive, or that maybe comes at a high cost, right? So like, let's say I decide my kids are doing something that's, making me really angry. And in that moment, I lose my cool and I yell at my kids to try to get them to stop. Well, maybe in that moment, maybe they might stop. Sometimes they might not. But let's say that they do. Okay, so in that moment, it's maybe helpful. But what I've done is kind of driven a wedge between me and my kids. And maybe a second later, they're like, wait a second, that wasn't really cool. Like, let me see what else I can do. Like, can I, she doesn't, like, they might be mad at me. They might want to retaliate in some way, shape, or form. And so it might ultimately backfire, and I might find myself putting out even more fires than I had initially.
Yeah, that unintended consequence sucks.
Right? Oh, yeah, totally.
It's such a common thing that we all face, is just like you try to solve the problem because it feels like, unbearable, and you're like, I just can't deal with this anymore. I just need to do something to get rid of it. And then you do, and then something happens and you're like, but now it's even worse now.
Right. Exactly.
right?
Ugh,
Or
why
if,
did I have to do that in the first place? Yeah.
or a totally different problem has come up and you're like,
Yes.
this is just never ending, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But actually, I just want to take a step back to look at that cycle of anxiety, right? Where perhaps we can go over the process of how an anxiety, which in the extreme becomes a phobia, let's say, the process of learning to be anxious about something and then going through an exposure therapy-like process to extinguish that anxiety, and like what exactly transpires when that happens.
Yeah, sure. So, well, maybe I'm going to start with one thing, which is that as far as I'm concerned, anxiety, like all other emotions, is actually a really adaptive emotion, right? We wouldn't want to be without it. I want to feel anxious when I'm getting ready to cross the street because otherwise I might not look both ways. Coming back to your initial point that there are some safety behaviors are warranted and are actually really important to act on. So that's the first piece, right? That like we can never get rid of anxiety altogether. And so to that, you said extinguish anxiety. And yes, we can help someone to not be driven by anxiety so that anxiety isn't always kind of controlling what they do or don't do. But we're not really getting rid of anxiety. We're more helping someone to change their relationship with anxiety. So they learn, hey, I can feel anxious and still do all the things that are important to me, that matter to me. I don't need to kind of change up what I do or don't do because of the fact that I'm feeling anxious in this moment. So to your question about like a phobia, let's imagine someone has what we call a metaphobia, which is a fear of vomiting. And that might develop for a number of different reasons, right? Maybe one time when they were little, they got really sick and they were vomiting and they just felt miserable, right? For days and days. Maybe they even had to be hospitalized because they were vomiting so much. Or maybe someone they loved and cared about had to be hospitalized. Or maybe one day a classmate of theirs vomited and everybody made fun of them, right? And now they're terrified that the same thing might happen, whatever it might be, right? So there are these, what we can think of as like conditioning events, these things that happened in the past that lead them to now, fear vomiting in the future or in the present. And so if that's the case, somebody who has a fear of vomiting might go to really, really extreme lengths to make sure that they don't ever, not only that they don't ever vomit, but that they don't feel queasy or nauseous ever in general. And so they may avoid certain foods because they're worried if I eat something that's not like super bland and simple that I know I can digest really easily, well, then I might get sick, right? Maybe they don't eat out even at restaurants because who knows whether the food might be contaminated with something that could make them sick. And they may carry Tums on them at all times. Ginger chews, right? Make sure that they've got like a ginger ale that they can drink. All those things, right? Those are really common. And all of those behaviors make a lot of sense because if the person doesn't want to vomit, doesn't want to feel nauseous, and feels anxious when that thought comes up, well then, if they do those things, okay, I can settle that upset stomach really quickly so I feel better. Same thing maybe when like they're watching a movie and a vomiting scene comes on and they feel really anxious and uncomfortable. Well, what do? You just change the channel so that you don't have to think about vomiting, right? And you don't have to feel, coming back to that piece of empathy, when we're watching something on the screen, oftentimes we feel a similar emotion to what the person on the screen seems to be feeling. And so it's not uncommon for somebody to feel kind of disgusted, almost like they might throw up themselves if they watch somebody vomit. So again, they might want to change the channel quickly. But all those behaviors reinforce that belief that, hey, I can't tolerate the possibility of vomiting, the possibility that I might one day vomit. And if I actually vomited, I really couldn't tolerate that. And so a lot of treatment for someone who has a fear of vomiting would involve intentionally approaching anxiety-provoking situations that might make someone feel like they could vomit, right? Intentionally doing that and doing that repeatedly for prolonged periods of time so that the person can learn, hey, I can tolerate feeling this way, right? I can tolerate the anxiety. I can tolerate the physical sensations of being nauseous. And I can still show up and live my life. Just because I'm feeling nauseous doesn't mean I have to run home, that I have to end this meeting early or whatever it might be. So we can get into like the nitty gritty of kind of what certain exposures might look like, or what exactly we might do there. But that at the end of the day is kind of a little bit about what we would do.
Right. And isn't it interesting how sometimes you have to teach or prove it to yourself or to your body that it's okay, right? Like you can even have a part of you that knows that it's a silly fear,
Yeah.
right? And that actually nothing bad really happens. But the anxiety is so powerful because it's such a rigid core belief that it doesn't matter how many times you tell yourself something, that anxiety is going to be there and it's going to take over or overpower that, so-called rational thinking about it. And
Yes.
it's really only through direct experience that you can teach yourself that it's okay and it's okay to manage.
Yep. And that's actually one of the reasons why when I'm helping someone who struggles with anxiety, I rarely go after trying to change their thoughts, right? We work on changing their behaviors, and in doing so, we change their thoughts because anxiety isn't so concerned with facts, logic, or reason. I actually recently was thinking about, did you ever see the movie Dumb and Dumber?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know that scene where Jim Carrey asks the attractive girl in the movie if she might ever consider going out with him on a date? Do you remember that scene?
Yeah.
Okay, and she says, there's like a 1 in a million or billion chance that I would say yes to that. And his response is, so you're telling me there's a chance? And he like lights up and he's so excited. And I kind of think of anxiety as being really similar in that even if it's like a 0.0000001% chance that something terrible could happen, if your anxiety has latched onto that as a potential possibility, trying to, reassure yourself that it's really unlikely to happen is probably not going to be all that effective. Your anxiety is going to keep coming back with, but what if this time it really does happen, right? What if this is like the exception to the rule? And so rather than trying to go down that route of changing thought, we're so much better off learning to just go ahead and go after, change the behavior, do the thing that, makes me fear I might vomit, and learn either one, hey, you know what? Even if I ride the spinning teacups at Disney World, I don't necessarily throw up. Maybe I feel nauseous, but I don't necessarily throw up. Or maybe I do. Maybe I get sick and I vomit, but you know what? I tolerated it and I got to like have this really fun experience with my kids being on that ride.
Right. It's about, because the classic anxiety thought is what if, right? And then the only solution is to prove it's okay, even if it's okay, right?
Right.
So what if this happens? Well, even if it does happen, I'll be okay.
Yes, though I'll just kind of make one little tweak, which is that, so again, you're right, that with anxiety, the thing that often fuels anxiety is uncertainty, right? And there are some fears that people have where like the feared outcome, I think you'd have a hard time convincing someone that they'd be okay. So if I worried that like maybe I might be a murderer, maybe one day I might just go ahead and like, I might snap. And in a moment of anger, I might just stab all the people I love and care about. Right? If that's my fear, convincing myself that it would be okay if that happened, probably one, it wouldn't be so adaptive. I don't want to convince myself that would be okay. Right? But two, it also probably wouldn't be okay. Right? Like my life would be ruined. The people's lives who I care about, their lives would be ruined. And so I think the key is coming back to this what if piece of like helping someone learn to tolerate that uncertainty. You know what? I'm going to tolerate that possibility that one day I could snap and I could kill everyone I love and care about with this knife, but I'm going to keep chopping vegetables with my sharp knives because I love preparing healthy food for my family. It's important for us to eat well, right? And so I'm going to do it anyway and sit with that uncertainty rather than convince myself that either that I'm unlikely to do that, which, probably I am unlikely to do that, but I can't say for sure that I would never do that, and try to convince myself that it would be okay if it did happen.
I see. That's a very good distinction to make in terms of being able to distinguish between like it's okay if it does happen, if it did happen, versus like the uncertainty itself is okay.
Right. I can tolerate that uncertainty, even though it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And evidently, if you figure that out for yourself, tends to decrease over time, right?
Yes, yeah. When you learn that you can tolerate uncertainty, it's like that muscle for tolerating uncertainty, for tolerating the anxiety and the distress, the discomfort that goes along with it. Your muscle gets stronger. And so I think of it as almost like being like a runner, someone who runs and is maybe out of shape and hasn't run in a long time, and then they get back out and start running. They might feel like it might be really hard to run 3 miles, right? And then, but if they keep running every day with time, running 3 miles, it's not that it ever becomes easy. They're going to still have to work hard, and they're going to be, especially if they're trying to improve, like, get faster. If they want to get faster as they run, those runs might be really hard each time as they try to beat their last time. But with time and practice, those muscles for running become stronger, and they know, hey, I can run 3 miles, right?
Yeah.
And same thing here. It's not that the anxiety or uncertainty are ever going to be like necessarily easy, but they become things that hey, I can do this. I can feel uncomfortable. I can feel anxious, and I can tolerate it. And I can tolerate the uncertainty that comes with that anxiety.
Right. It's okay to feel the feelings, even if it's
Yeah.
difficult. It's
Yeah.
just a different approach of being comfortable or just tolerating and accepting the uncertainty. But now, maybe we can talk about a little bit what happens when that goes to the extreme and you end up in panic. Right? Because that's the extreme version of anxiety.
Yeah, though what I would actually argue is that so if I were a chef and I wanted to whip up like the perfect recipe for a panic attack, I would just need two really key ingredients. I would need intense physical sensations, and I would need fearful responding to those physical sensations, right? And so to your point of, so let's say somebody's saying, I can tolerate these sensations. I'm going to let myself tolerate these sensations in full. I'm not going to do anything to make them go away. I'm going to see how long they last, how long they stick around for. I would be almost shocked if you told me that turned into a full-blown panic attack for someone. It's really that attempt to try to, let's say somebody's kind of, hyperventilating. They're having a hard time breathing. They feel tight in their chest. Their heart is racing. And they view those sensations as potentially dangerous, right? And so then they try to turn those sensations down. They try to stop them themselves from feeling that. Maybe they try to do some deep breathing, or they try to do a mindfulness exercise. They lay on the floor. They, whatever it might be, they try to do something to get rid of that sensation of panic. It might work sometimes, but other times it probably isn't going to be so effective. What's going to happen is they try to control their breathing to slow it down. But what do you know? It kind of like quickens, right? And then they become even more anxious about the fact that they can't tamp this down. And that's when it usually escalates into a full-blown panic attack. Or, they just don't have the option, the ability to do the things that usually calm themselves when they're feeling anxious. So they can't use those tools. And that's when anxiety increases. And so, but if we just like welcome that panic, it usually runs its course pretty quickly, and doesn't usually escalate as much as it would if we're trying to shut it down.
Yeah, and it's also interesting how people who suffer from panic attacks, often what causes the panic attack is the fear of a panic attack, right? It's this terrible cycle to get stuck in of like, I feel the symptom. What if this is a panic attack? Oh my God, it might be a panic attack. Let me reach for my safety behaviors. It's not working. Look, this symptom, is just a sign that I'm having a panic attack. The anxiety goes through the roof, and then what do you know? You have a panic attack. And you've just proved it to yourself that when you have that symptom, it leads to panic attacks. So it reinforces that cycle again. And that's super unfortunate.
Yeah. And so in treatment, ideally what we would want to do is kind of not only like we'd want to welcome those sensations, right? And almost like bring on the panic-like sensations and, accept that, who knows, maybe it's going to turn into a full-blown panic attack. Right. And okay, if it does, it does. And so when if I'm meeting with someone and they're having a panic attack, I try to be really warm and, it's hard. I get it. And I am not in any way afraid of that. Right. And I'm not trying to make them, help them calm down in any way. No, I want them to learn, they can tolerate experiencing that panic. And when we do, when we welcome it, when we let it last as long as it needs to, it actually usually tends to decline relatively quickly. But even if it lasts for a little longer, then somebody learns, you know what, I can handle that. I didn't think I could like still work while I was panicking. I didn't think I could have a conversation while I was panicking. And you know what? I actually did all of those things.
And how do you help people when the panic is associated with like trauma flashbacks?
Yeah.
Because is that the same thing?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. So we have, when it comes to panic attacks, sometimes we have what we call like cued or triggered panic attacks, right? So I had a memory, a flashback, and that caused me to have a panic attack. And then other times they're uncued, right? Maybe I was just folding my laundry and boom, all of a sudden I had a panic attack. Either way, ideally, we want those sensations. We want to welcome the sensations. And when it comes to trauma, probably the best place to help someone who's having panic attacks related to flashbacks is to actually help them learn that they can tolerate the thing that triggers the panic sensations. So if it's the memory, the flashback that leads to the panic, well, then we're going to do, in the treatment that I provide for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, we would do something called prolonged exposure, and specifically imaginal exposure, where someone is recounting the memory of their trauma repeatedly in session with me and then listening to a recording of that for homework. And when they do that, they learn, hey, this memory that maybe I've gone out of my way to avoid thinking about, talking about, or that maybe I've allowed myself to think about and talk about, but that like I've tried to not feel anything in relation to, right? Like I've almost like told it like it's a police report. But instead, I can allow myself to revisit that memory and feel all the feelings or very similar feelings to those that I had at the time the memory was occurring. I can do that, and I can do that for prolonged periods of time, and I can tolerate that. And when someone learns they can do that, then when the memory pops up while they're folding their laundry, or, you know, when they see a movie that triggers them to remember what happened, they're not as overwhelmed, right? They know they can handle that because they've done that a million times before in session and out of session.
I see. So the memory acts as the cue, and then it's similar to a somatic symptom that you might say you learn to tolerate in normal life that doesn't necessarily lead to panic, and then through the prolonged exposure, it's like, oh, I can actually tolerate these symptoms on their own, and they don't always lead to panic attacks. And even if it did lead to a panic attack, like that's okay because I'll survive, and it'll be all right.
Yep. And same thing with, right, you know, it might not just be the memory that for someone who experienced a trauma that triggers the panic. It could be smelling the cologne that their perpetrator wore, or seeing something that just reminds them, hearing music that was playing at the time that their trauma occurred, right? And so same idea there, though. We're going to approach the thing that triggers that anxiety, that panic, and learn, okay, I can tolerate those feelings as well.
Yeah, and it's actually remarkable the kinds of feelings that we can tolerate. Right? Because if you think about like the worst trauma that people go through and then get PTSD from it, it's really remarkable the kind of feelings that you can then conjure up when you're thinking about it again and feel them and then still be okay. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. I think a lot of times we're way stronger than we give ourselves credit for, right?
Yeah.
And learning that strength, like kind of testing that out, learning, hey, I can relate differently to my emotions. I can feel strong, intense, unwanted emotions and not let them control me. That can be so empowering, so freeing to realize.
Yeah. But before we move on from the panic, I just want to check, like, what exactly is panic?
Great question. And again, I think this is where I probably, if I had a textbook handy, I'd go back to it and I'd pull it up and give you a much more concise, helpful definition here. I don't have that with me.
No, it's okay.
But I think when I think of panic, right, there are usually, in general, when we have anxiety, tend to be three components. There are our thoughts, right? Oh no, this is dangerous. Something terrible might happen, whatever it might be. Then there are intense physical sensations, right? So maybe my heart's racing, I'm tight in my body, I'm hyperventilating, like it's hard to breathe. I might feel lightheaded, nauseous. So with panic, there can be so many different symptoms. I might almost feel like things aren't real, right? I might feel like I'm outside of my body. Maybe I have some nausea, some stomach discomfort, all different sorts of things, even tingling in my fingers and toes. So I might have all these intense physical symptoms. And then usually there are these, this like kind of behavioral component, right? An urge to act in a certain way. So maybe I want to avoid that feeling, right? Those sensations. So that's typically what we experience when we're panicking. And again, usually it's almost like this heightened level of anxiety when we're panicking.
Right. So it's like the extreme or maximal level of anxiety, right? Because it's like the symptoms you experience with anxiety at their maximum level. And it can feel, and actually is overwhelming in many instances.
Yeah.
You can learn to deal with it, but it is overwhelming.
Yep. And when we think of a panic attack, usually it's something that we experience pretty rapidly, that it comes on. It's not like it builds up all day long, but usually, there's something that prompts us. Maybe it's just like noticing, oh, wow, my heart's racing. And that might be the cue for me maybe I'm worried I'm going to have a heart attack, right? And so usually it's within seconds, maybe minutes, that it really spikes and kind of peaks into what I experience as just this overwhelming level of anxiety.
Yeah. And then, it can even be so intense that, as you said, like people get, depersonalization or derealization and dissociation, where your mind just like checks out, basically. And it's like, I can't deal with this.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one.
For sure.
I've never personally experienced it, but I imagine it would be very scary.
Yeah, and it can be. And again, same thing. If you think about it, like none of these physical sensations that we're describing, unless somebody's like actually having a heart attack, that having your heart racing isn't actually dangerous in and of itself. Experiencing derealization isn't actually dangerous. And so again, as part of treatment, a large kind of part of what we're doing is helping someone learn, I can tolerate all of those uncomfortable sensations, including that sense of derealization. So we were talking before we even kind of hopped on here, before we really got started today and started recording this, just about interoceptive exposures, which are exposures to the bodily sensations that someone feels when they're anxious. And there are even interoceptive exposures for derealization, things people can do to help them almost feel like, things might not be real, or maybe I'm like not fully present, because that can be really anxiety provoking for people. And what can happen is then they feel like, oh no, yikes, I'm experiencing this, this state that I don't want to experience. I've got to do something to fix it, to make it go away. And again, it's those avoidance behaviors, those attempts to try to change what someone's feeling that oftentimes make it last longer, right? Maybe even exacerbate it, maintain it. And so again, here, even though, yes, it's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable, our goal is going to be to purposely bring it on, to learn to relate differently to that sensation of derealization, to kind of all components of anxiety, to all the aspects, all the ways in which it manifests. Our goal is to relate differently to it, to welcome it, as opposed to try to avoid it or make it go away.
Yeah, okay. That actually makes sense, right? It's like the derealization and the dissociation are not dangerous. They're not great, but they're not dangerous.
Right.
And so what do actually some of those... Now, no one should ever try this without the presence of a clinician that's, certified and qualified. But what do some of those like derealization, interoceptive exposure exercises look like?
Yeah, so for derealization, there are a number of different ones. One, if you look up spiral staring, and yes, I would say in general, I agree with you that it's probably wise to do this with a clinician by your, whether it's virtually or in person. But you can find spiral staring exercises on YouTube. So even just watching one of those videos, where it spins round and round, watching one, and you can You could either just watch it on its own, or for some people, sometimes hyperventilating, so breathing really quickly, right? And you can do hyperventilating for 45 seconds at a time. Give yourself a 15-second break, and then hyperventilate again for another 45 seconds, 15-second break, and one more 45-second trial. So it's basically watching for 3 minutes, hyperventilating 3 different times for 45 seconds at a time. Give yourself a break in between. And like after that first 3 minutes, maybe you pause for a few minutes, and then you do it again, right? And purposely bring on those sensations, continue to bring them on. That can be helpful. There's also, if you stare at a light or at a mirror or a blank wall, there are different things you can do there to also bring on that experience of derealization. And then people have their own unique things too. They notice, right, when I'm really hot, or, when my heart's really racing or something like that. That's oftentimes what triggers me to experience this. So then we're going to purposely do the thing that triggers that experience for them.
Right. They can use their own triggers. It doesn't have to be artificially created. It can be what actually triggers these things, when we can just do it again and again and again until it calms down.
Yeah, and I have people who sometimes say that, what the exposure that they do in session with me is never quite as hard to navigate as it is when they're triggered in the moment, when like something happens organically that makes them anxious. And they're right. It's probably not going to ever be as hard. And if we can approximate that experience of, suddenly being flooded with panic in the grocery store or whatever it might be, if we can come as close as possible to approximating that in session and practice welcoming, tolerating all of the sensations that come with that, the emotions that come with that, well, they're going to be a lot better positioned to be able to skillfully respond in the moment when those sensations kind of catch them off guard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you can only do the best that you can in a non-real environment, right? Like, it's never going to be the same, but you can try your best to approximate as close as possible to what might happen in real life, because otherwise it's not practice. Right, it's just, I mean, you're practicing when it's happening in real life anyway, but it's not conscious practice in the same way. So that makes sense. On a slightly different note, I wanted to talk to you about emotional memories.
Okay.
Right? Now, how does it work that, we have memories that have such strong emotional associations? And not so much the neuroscience of it, but just the mechanism of, like, when you have a memory, it activates a very strong emotion in you sometimes, right? But other memories, it's not so emotional, right? Is there a reason why that is?
Yeah. So my understanding, and I again, this is not from a textbook here, but right, that there are certain memories that are intended to evoke stronger emotions. If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense. Like, today I had breakfast and nothing eventful happened, right? So chances are, if I think about, I may not even remember having breakfast if you ask me a week from now, like, what exactly happened while I was eating breakfast today. That emotion, it's not, or that memory isn't really going to serve me so well, help protect me in the future, isn't going to, I didn't really learn much from that, right? But there are other events that happen that are really critical, and we want to remember them, and ideally act in a way that we've, I shouldn't say ideally now that I say that, because I'm realizing sometimes we have emotional memories that lead us to act in the future in ways that aren't so helpful, right? Because we're remembering what happened in the past. But evolutionarily speaking, I think that's the original purpose. So if I was in the woods and I don't know, I encountered a bear and I felt this feeling of fear and anxiety, and now in the future, when I'm in the woods, I remember seeing that bear and I feel that fear and anxiety. Well, that fear and anxiety in a way might help me to be a little more alert and cautious while I'm going through the woods, right? Looking out for possible bears. So there are certain times where that can be useful. Other times where, again, then if I'm like feeling alert and on guard that there might be a bear when I'm walking down my sidewalk in a, in a city, that might not be so useful, so helpful. But so coming back to your question, I don't think I've done the best job here of answering that.
No, it's okay. So from what I understand, you're saying, and I think you're absolutely correct in saying that, emotion or memories are tied to the meaning it has for us and the impact that it has on us. And so things that are required to be remembered more precisely tend to have stronger emotional attachments to them, because the emotions, like we said, signal certain things to us and make us aware of what's going on in the situation and communicate that to other people as well. And so some memories have strong emotions because we need to remember them. Well, we think we need to remember them, and others don't because they're irrelevant information, right? Because there was no strong emotional response.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a perfect answer. It's exactly right, and it's tough because it's also fascinating how we can conjure up emotions intentionally, right? Where you can just think about a situation that made you feel a certain way, and you will feel that way, right? Maybe a slight degree off in intensity, but maybe not. Some people can do it where they rarely embody the same emotional experience that they had at the time when the memory was formed as they do now when they're remembering it. And it's interesting that can happen because we can also use that to generate positive emotions in ourselves, right? Through like imagery work or things like that.
Yeah. Even, right, we've been focusing a lot on some of those unwanted emotions like anxiety, right? And even just thinking about the things that you're grateful for in the day that happened, right? Kind of reviewing the last 24 hours and thinking about like, what are all those little things that happened that I'm grateful for? The way someone smiled at me, this lovely conversation I'm getting to have here with Shane, right? Like there are all these little things that if you go back and you recount them and then think about, what was I feeling at the time, and allow yourself to almost like remember what it was like being in that moment. Yeah, then you can actually re-experience those positive feelings too later in the day. And there are studies, that have looked at that have shown just that act of practicing gratitude can certainly boost your mood.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy, and it's like, we're so afraid of emotions and that they're going to be bad for us, but they're so useful, and we can use them in all kinds of ways, and we can use them intentionally as well to boost our mood, to make us feel better, to, have more of a positive outlook on things. I mean, if you're not having such a good day, of course your emotions, fuel your mood states and things like that, but you can also make a conscious decision to say, okay, I'm going to switch this around, right? This is what I'm feeling right now, and that's okay, but I'm going to switch this around. Let me think about all the things I'm grateful for, or let me think of a time when I felt really happy, or, feelings of love or joy or satisfaction or achievement or accomplishment or any of these things. And then if you focus on it long enough and you really try and feel those things, you will start to feel them. And it's wild, but it's so cool that can happen.
For sure. And the one thing that I would just note is that I think it's also important to note, like, that to your point that you said initially, that I can feel this emotion, this not so great feeling emotion that I'm having at the moment. I can feel this. And it's not that I'm trying to avoid it, that like that I can't let myself feel sad, right? It's that maybe I'm noticing that sadness isn't serving me so well in the moment. And it might still stick around for a little bit. It might be here. So I'm not even doing it as a way to necessarily shut down that initial emotion, just to see, can I shift this a little bit? Can I start to feel something a little different that might allow me to be a little more effective, a little more skillful? That might help me enjoy my day a little bit more. But I think it's just key that it's not, because again, if we like really just in most of the time, if we try to shut down any emotion, it tends to backfire.
Yeah, right. Shifting, not suppressing or getting rid of.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Just loosening it a little bit and maybe introducing something else as well. So maybe you're still feeling a little bit of sadness, but also you're feeling a little bit of gratitude now. And, the valence of that experience has changed. So it's not so uncomfortable and unpleasant because there's less of it. And now there's more positive aspects to the experience as well. That's, more... it's all tolerable, but it's nicer, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
It's hard to argue that it's nicer to feel joy than sadness. So why not bring some joy if there's a bit of sadness or something like that, and just see if you can loosen it up a little bit. But also respecting that the sadness serves a purpose, right? And not doing it immediately upon feeling sad.
Right.
And trying to get rid of it, like, oh, I don't feel good, I must get rid of this now.
Right.
It's like, no, it's okay. I feel sad. This is what it feels like. These are the sensations I'm feeling in my body. What's it trying to tell me? Just going through a process of that kind of experience and sitting with it for a while. And then if it doesn't go away, then you can say, okay, let me try shift this a little bit. All right? Let me just take a little step forwards.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you
so
say
not
that's
having
the
that
process?
knee-jerk...
Yeah.
Not having that knee-jerk reaction of, I've got to get rid of this immediately, right? Like allowing that emotion to be there. And sometimes what's kind of neat too about emotions is this idea that if we don't do anything to get rid of them, they usually do run their course naturally, right? So the key though is also kind of coming back to that model of emotions where we talked about oftentimes when we have a given emotion or we want to act on a certain urge that goes along with that emotion. So with fear or so with anxiety, I should say, the action urge that accompanies that is usually to avoid, to try to make the anxiety go away. With sadness, oftentimes the urge can be to like hole up, to withdraw. And so what's tricky is if we say like stay in bed all day, we're feeling sad and we stay in bed all day, chances are we're not going to actually feel any different. But in fact, we might even feel worse. We might feel more sad by the end of the day because we haven't had any opportunity to feel something different. We haven't had any positive reinforcement in the day, something that might help to kind of jog us out of what we're feeling. Instead, if we allow ourselves to say, yeah, I'm feeling sad right now, right? Like whatever, sad about whatever it might be. And I'm not going to let that hold me back. I'm still going to go about my day. So I'm not going to give into the action urge that goes along with my sadness, which is just to stay in bed with the curtains closed all day. Instead, I'm going to meet up with my friend for lunch and I'm going to, get some work done and cook for my family, whatever, all of that. If we do all those things, then chances are that emotion of sadness might like kind of naturally just dissipate on its own, not because we're trying to change it, but just because we've allowed ourselves to feel it and it's had a chance to kind of run its course.
Yeah. The behavioral urge is where we get stuck, right? Of just being like, I'm just going to listen to it because it's what I feel like will make me feel better. Right. And it's so counterintuitive because, when you are sad and you feel like you want to just lie in bed all day, you feel like that's going to help you, right? You feel like this is what I need. And it's so weird that we aren't directed towards helpful behaviors in those moments. Avoidance makes sense, right? Like, that makes sense. But the withdrawing doesn't really make sense to me. Like, does it make sense to you? Like,
withdrawing from other people when feeling sad?
Yeah, how could we make sense of that from, like, at least it makes sense, not that it's a good option?
From an evolutionary perspective, I think there is an argument for withdrawing, and I just am trying to think of exactly, with sadness, for instance. But I think if I'm feeling sad about something I've lost, maybe in some way, if you think about it, like withdrawing, maybe then I don't have to feel sad about losing somebody else, right? Like I'm not going to connect with someone else that I might lose. You could argue that, right? So I don't have to feel that emotion again. Or maybe I withdraw and instead of doing things that could, in theory, bring harm to someone I love and care about, that could be risky, maybe now, I keep my family home and we stay inside all day. And so we're safer. So then I'm less likely to lose someone else I love and care about. That's maybe a stretch, but And so it may be less about withdrawing being when sad, being an adaptive kind of thing that we do, and more just what the urge that comes along with that sadness is to withdraw. And I just want to know, I'm not saying that like people should never allow themselves to stay in bed a little longer, right? To do something that brings them some comfort. I think it's about noticing, oh yeah, you know, I stayed in bed all day today because I was feeling sad, or I've stayed in bed for days and days, right? I haven't gotten any work done. I haven't connected with anyone. And noticing that and thinking about, oh, is that really serving me well? Is it effective? Is it helping me to get back to living my life? Or is it maybe perpetuating this emotion that I'm feeling?
Yeah, no, that's true. And it's not about, you know, like never allowing ourselves comfort. It's like, it's good to comfort yourself when you need it, but not letting it go too far that it's starting to have a negative impact on you and on your life and on you know, maybe the people around you as well. But let's just focus on you for the moment and just say, you know, is this beneficial to me? Is it serving me? And sometimes it's tough. Sometimes it's so intense that people can't do that, right? And they get stuck, and then they need help being pulled out. And that's okay too.
Yeah. And I'll also note too that sometimes this is maybe in part because I treat a lot of anxiety, but with anxiety, sometimes it can be tricky because the action urge that goes along with it can actually seem adaptive, right? So if someone's anxious about their school performance and they work like, you know, nonstop all the time, and they get really good grades and they get praised a lot for that, well then that, you know, rereading their paper 100 times before submitting it might not seem like it's getting in their way, right? It might actually seem like it's serving them well, and that the reason they're getting their A's is because they're putting in so much work.
Yeah.
Right.
But it comes at a cost.
Yeah, right. So oftentimes there are other areas in which maybe they're not doing so well as a result of the behaviors that they're engaging in service of the emotion they're feeling.
Yeah. So it's just about really just learning to reflect on your own life and on your own behaviors and your own thoughts and feelings, and saying, you know, is this serving me, and doing it in a realistically objective way, right? Where you're not trying to catch yourself out or punish yourself or praise yourself or any of that kind of thing at this point. It's really just saying, okay, well, firstly, what exactly am I doing? And why do I think I'm doing it? And do I need to keep doing it? And do I want to keep doing it? And if I do, okay, fine. And if not, what can I do to make some change? And start small, right? You don't have to jump all the way in and redo an entire life. It's an impossibility. It's just one thing at a time, and say, okay, well, you know, maybe if you're checking your paper 100 times, well, maybe next time you can check it 90 times and see what happens. And if that's still the same, then you can keep reducing it over and over. You don't have to now all of a sudden only put in an hour's work and say, well, let's see what happens. Like, that's silly. But it's about just having that sort of self-reflective insight to be able to say what's working for me and what's not.
Yeah. It's easier said than done, right? I think a lot of times it can even just be uncomfortable to acknowledge, oh, something I'm doing maybe isn't working so well for me, right? Like that can bring up discomfort, right, on its own. So I think noting that, and then also sometimes we can be pretty hard on ourselves or black and white in our thinking and think, well, I either do this thing or I don't do this thing, right? And so we feel like we've got to go to the extreme. And like you said, sometimes that can then be overwhelming and almost be like setting ourselves up for failure. And so sometimes taking those gradual steps can be really useful. And also too, so one of the things that I really talk with people a lot when working with anxiety is this idea that like, you're not going to be perfect, right? A lot of times the very first step to being able to change a behavior, especially an emotionally driven one that you're doing in response to anxiety, let's say, one of the very first steps is just to become aware of that behavior, right? We can't change a behavior unless we're aware of it. And so starting to become aware, and then gradually starting to work on seeing if you can change that behavior, not always give in to the urge that accompanies the emotion. And knowing that sometimes you're gonna give in, right? Sometimes you're gonna have like a misstep, but not seeing that as like a sign that you're a failure, that you can't do this, right? That this approach can't work for you, but instead just, oh yeah, I had a little misstep, I stumbled. Let me get back on the path that I'm trying to follow and regain my footing here.
Yeah, it's an iterative process, right? Personal growth always is. And it's a lifetime project. There's no fixing it now and then it's good to go. There's always change, and you're always going to need improvement, and things always go wrong. And it's about learning to navigate that skillfully and being okay with doing so, right?
For sure.
And as you say, one step at a time. No one's perfect. It's okay to mess up, which we all do all the time. And it's just about keep going and doing it and treating yourself, I think, with kindness and compassion. Right? It's super important too, because you're not going to whip yourself into shape and be happy about it. You might do it, but you're not going to be happy. Right? It's not the best way to do things. Like, I mean, it's well known, like, you don't, parenting, when a kid comes home with a bad grade, you don't say, you suck, you should just give up, you'll never amount to anything, and say, go do better next time. Like, maybe the fear will help them do better next time, but that's not going to have long-term good consequences, right? Your kid comes home and you're like, I'm sorry, it sucks, and what can we do now to make it better for you next time? And, here's a hug or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's how you should treat yourself.
Yeah, and same thing with ourselves. As I think you and I talked earlier, that it is really important to me to like to show up lovingly for my kids, right? And to model effective emotion regulation for them. And so I really try not to ever yell or raise my voice with my kids. Like I try to just always treat them respectfully and lovingly. And I'm not perfect. And there have been moments in time where I've lost my cool and I haven't been as warm as I would like to be, as calm, as loving as I would like to be. And I kind of back in the day when my kids were younger, I used to beat myself up a lot, like mentally for that, right? Like, how could I do that? Right? Like, what was I doing? And I remember just this one day after having kind of lost my cool, I remember I was beating myself up and I realized, just how, like, when my kids mess up, I try to not like yell at them and lash out at them and like give them a hard time about it, but try to understand what was going on for them and validate that experience. And right, because I know that trying to punish them, shame them, isn't going to lead them to necessarily do better, to feel better about themselves. And usually we show up as our best selves when we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. And so I realized, just like I don't want to do that to them, like castigating myself here probably isn't all that useful either. And so now when I do mess up, right, I try to, that was hard, right? Sucked in the moment. I wish that hadn't happened, and it did. And so then I, go to my kids and I repair. I'm so sorry. Like I was a little short in my tone there, right? And I love you, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, modeling repairing behavior, and how it's okay to lose it sometimes if you take the steps to fix it afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Alissa, this has been such a really fun conversation, and I really do appreciate you coming on. And if there's anything that you'd like to promote, where can people find you, your website? I'll include links and stuff in the description as well, but just from your perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Shane. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I could keep chatting with you for a while.
Forever, yeah. It's always fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you, and I look forward to having you on again sometime soon.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
You too.